Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's great to see you all this morning. Welcome back to our lecture series. Today we're going to be talking about emperors and shoguns, a brief history of Japan. And as with all of these 45-minute or so lectures, I am going to be skipping over the details. If anybody here is an expert on Japanese history, I apologize in advance, because I will not be able to get into a lot of the kind of detail, much of it very interesting, but not possible in this time frame. I also want to give you, again, all of the lectures that I'm giving on board all of the next 5 cruises here between now and Seward, Alaska. In May, when my wife and I return, she's videotaping these. We will put those online at litchapala.org. It stands for Lakeside Institute of Theology, if that helps you remember it. Chapala, CHAPALA.org, plus all of the previous lectures that we've done on 11 earlier cruises, plus community lectures and classes and a lot of other things. As I said yesterday, there's over 500 hours of video lecture that you can access. So, and it's all free of charge, and you can get the PowerPoints as well if you want to look at any of the images again, or maps or anything like that. So that's available to you as one of the added benefits of being here with WinStar, okay? This morning, Emperors and Shoguns, Brief History of Japan. This afternoon, I will dig in a little deeper on the particular topic of the Japanese samurai and the code of Bushido, which was sort of the code of chivalry that the samurai lived by, their code of honor. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the samurai during this brief history of Japan, because I'll be unfolding that in more detail this afternoon. And then we get into much more China focus as we head onto the coast of China. We'll do a brief history of China, religions of China, the Chinese treasure ships, opium wars and the Boxer Rebellion, Silk Road empires, and the Great Wall. So that gives you an idea of where we're going. But right now we want to talk about a brief history of Japan. Oh, speaking of where we're going, that's where we're going. Brief history of Japan. As I'm sure you probably have figured out by now, if you didn't already know, there are 4 primary mainland islands of Japan. They are, starting in the south, Kyushu, then the smallest of the islands, Shikoku, the largest in Central Island, Honshu, and then in the north, Hokkaido. Now, there are thousands of other small islands, most of them not even inhabited, but there are a lot of islands in this chain. There is no real evidence as to when the earliest human beings settled or arrived in the Japanese islands. Prior to World War II, it was thought that there was no evidence of human habitation until the late Stone Age. Since World War II, they have found a number of different sites that indicate that there were early Stone Age residents here. And it's believed that at one point there were, up here at the top, is the Soya Strait that separates the northern island of Hokkaido from Russia, from the mainland of Asia. And there's another strait here called the Tsugaru Strait. It's believed that at one time it was possible to cross over. There were land bridges in both those places. And then also the Tsushima Straits, which is between Korea and the island of Kyushu, that you could cross there as well. And so it's believed that there were inhabitants from the mainland of Asia that came over both through Korea, across what is now the Tsushima Straits, and then from the north as well, over land bridges. The 2 earliest eras of human habitation that we have evidence of are well, you really can't read those in these light, can you? This is the Jomon, Jomon culture. It is dated from 10,500 to 300 BC. It is notable particularly because of very primitive tools. They did not have a lot of the things we think of as part of later civilization. They didn't do a cultivation of crops other than very rudimentary like taro or yams, but they didn't grow wheats or rice at that point. Rice had not been introduced to Japan. They were primarily known for their ceramics, and there's a particular style. In fact, the word Jomon that they named this culture for means rope design. And so the various kinds of ceramics, now these were just hand-built ceramics, they were not thrown ceramics, in other words, they didn't use a wheel, but very distinctive kind of designs. And so they did have some agriculture. They were primarily hunters and fishermen. but their agriculture was very primitive, just root crops. But we do know that they had the sophistication for ceramics. The next age is called the Yayoi period, and there was a huge leap forward in between these two periods. The Yayoi period is believed to have started around 300 BC to about 250 AD. Now you'll notice those are fairly late dates, and these are the earliest cultures in Japan. Unlike China, whose culture goes back 4,000 years, most of Japan's real cultural development, and most of what we'll talk about today, has happened in the last 2,000 years. And so it's a much shorter kind of time period, and much of it influenced by China and by Korea as well. But the Yayoi period, they had discovered throne pottery, so they could do more sophisticated bowls and things of that sort. They also developed it's during the Iron Age, they developed simple metallurgy to make iron bells, which is what you see there. Many of them beautifully decorated. They also developed rice cultivation, which is believed was brought over from Korea. They had textile production, which under the earlier period, Jomon period, we have no evidence of clothing, but it's believed they probably used bark to create clothing. They actually developed the weaving of textiles under the Yayoi period, and they also did quite a bit in terms of burial rites. One of the signs of a sophisticated society is when they have very distinctive burial rituals, that they will bury people in a certain way, and they will include various artifacts with them. We don't see that under the Jomon period, but we do find that in the Yayoi period. So we see a huge development in those two periods. But again, we're talking that period lasting up until 250 AD, so 250 years after the time of Christ. So it's a fairly late development we're talking about there. Following that period, we come to what is known as the Yamato period, the early Imperial period. And again, in each of these cases, there are huge jumps forward. The Yamato period is the earliest Imperial age. Imperial in the sense that there was a central figure who was seen as the leader. He was called a Tenno, which means Emperor of Heaven, and there was a very distinctive court structure that they developed, 12 different levels of court officials. And so we see a very quick development of a fairly complex political system on this. In particular, one of the things that's sometimes called the Tumulus period, because I don't know have any of you all been to Osaka? Have you seen the tombs in the middle of Osaka? They look like islands, right? This is the downtown Osaka. Osaka was sort of the center of the Yamato period. These big keyhole-shaped things are actually tombs, and they still exist in Osaka. If you're in Osaka, you can actually visit them. I mean, you can't go into the tombs, but you can see that they are there. The biggest one, for instance, here, this one, was built for the Emperor Ogen during the Yamato period, and that tomb in the 5th century, built in the 5th century, is 1,380 feet long. It's estimated it would have taken 1,000 workers working from morning to night 4 years just to construct that tomb. Now, that's a long way from anything we saw previously, so there are huge advances in terms of the civilization there. This is the same period of time, by the way, the Yamato period, when Buddhism came into Japan. There had been, they believe that there might have been some trickling of knowledge about Buddhism earlier, but the 6th century, usually it's at 552, was when Buddhism came into Japan. One of the princes in the Yamato period, Prince Shoteku, was primarily an advocate of Buddhism. He built temples and pagodas and shrines. In particular, after doing that sort of bits and pieces, he finally ordered that every province in Japan, at least that was under his control, because this is before the entire of the islands were under his control, every province had to have a Buddhist monastery with at least 20 monks and 10 nuns in residence. The role of those monks and nuns was to pray for the benefit of the state. That was their full-time job. He then put up pagodas and other kinds of shrines, so he was a very strong advocate of Buddhism as being the center part of their government. Now, early on, before this prince got very involved in formalizing Buddhism, it's believed a lot of people just thought it was beautiful and admirable, and they were anxious to take advantage of what they perceived as almost the magical promises of Buddhism. But then it became quite formalized. In the 660s, there were a series of reforms that occurred called the Taiko Reforms, and these established an even clearer imperial structure, but particularly it created a system called the Ritsuryu system. Ritsuryu system is taken from two words. Ritsu means the government structure, which I just mentioned, and Ryu means the civil law or administrative law. This was a very intentional kind of system that designed the way the government would work and also how it would control the land. It basically declared that the state, particularly the emperor, owned all the land that was under their control, and the government, the emperor, would then parcel out that land to individuals according to a certain size of, and by this time their cultivated rice has become a major crop, so a certain square meterage of rice paddies would be assigned to male children at the age of 6. And that 6-year-old boy, from that point on, he had the right to farm that land, even though he didn't own it. The emperor owned it. But by farming that land, they then paid back every year, both by a rice tax, where they would give a certain amount, only about 3%, and they believe, of the rice product back to the emperor. But then there was also a head tax. Every male was taxed, and that was a pretty much more significant amount of money. So this established that the government, and particularly the emperor, owned all the land and got part of the benefit from it and the right to tax people. And this is how the government sustained itself and how it grew. At that point, the government, the central government, was responsible, and again it was located in Osaka at that point. They had their own tax collectors, their own governors that they assigned out there. And so all of the authority was held in the central government. I say that because that changed later on in a very significant way that led to a lot of the dramatic history of Japan. The Nara period, they refer to as the start of the imperial state because, and most of these periods are named for where they were located. Nara is a city. And it's the start of the imperial state because it expanded, and the Taiko Reforms really formalized it in a way that they did have a centralized imperial government that was effective in controlling most of what we know of today as Japan. Nara was the first permanent capital. Prior to that, the various emperors, when a new emperor would come along, he would move the capital because he felt staying in the city where his predecessor died was bad luck. And so every time a new emperor came along, they would move to a new city. Nara was the first permanent capital, where they got over that, and after the first emperor, the Nara Emperor, died, the second one said, I don't need to rebuild a whole new imperial complex in a different city, so they stayed there. During that period of time, because Nara, they were in Nara longer, and Buddhism had really developed at that point, there was a real flourishing of culture, particularly Buddhist culture, but you saw a lot of development of literature, even though at this point they had not developed a Japanese script. It didn't happen until the 10th century that they began developing a uniquely Japanese script, 2 of them actually. Prior to this, they were using entirely Chinese characters. So they were, and so only people who could learn Chinese really were involved in literature. But still, there was a development of art, of architecture, of writing during this time, especially poetry. The Ritsuryu system that I talked about, that is how they managed the land, the administrative process, was working pretty well at this point, and they introduced under the Nara period the ability to advance based on merit. Prior to this, you needed to be related to one of the wealthy families. During this period of time, they developed a program where anyone could take a test based upon the law, and particularly on Buddhist doctrine. In China, they had Confucian doctrine, same sort of system. In fact, they adopted this in Japan from the Chinese model. But in Japan, you took a test to see how well you knew Buddhist doctrine, which is considered the foundation of the government system, and how well you knew the administrative laws. And if you passed, then you could get a position in the bureaucracy. It was sort of like the civil service exam, I guess, in the US if you want to work in the postal service or something. But and then every year, all of these bureaucrats that worked in the system would be tested to see if they were maintaining the quality needed. And if they weren't, they were sent down until they could pass the tests again. Well, anybody could do this. You didn't have to be born into a well-off family at this point. So that meant that it became more of a meritocracy, that everyone had an opportunity to develop into a position. This is a period in which, as I say, the Buddhist culture developed. This is the Daibutsu, or the great Nara Buddha. It's an enormous past Buddha figure. And for this period of time, the task of doing this was extraordinary. I mean, it was very difficult. It took a long time, a lot of effort to try to develop the ability to create something in metal this large. As I say, there was a real emphasis on Buddhist monks and monasteries, etc., and that ended up later on becoming a real problem. During the Nara period, particularly, late Nara period, the Buddhist monks started wanting to run everything because Buddhism was seen as the foundation of the government, the Buddhist monks, and there were times when they actually took up arms. The Buddhist monks back then it was not unknown for them to be militant, to take up arms and to try to fight to get what they thought they wanted. Well, eventually the emperor, the Nara Emperor, got so tired of that because Nara was a center as the capital of the Buddhist faith. It was spread out everywhere, but that was the center. He ended up finally, later in the Nara period, moving the capital again to Kyoto. And he did it primarily to get away from the influence of the Buddhist monks back in Nara, who were trying to force him to run the country in a particular way. So the capital was moved to Kyoto, and it was also at this point that the Emperor Shomu married a woman who was the daughter of the head of the Fujiwara family. Now that becomes important because later on, particularly later on, they end up with some child emperors. The emperors died early and they had children who inherited the imperial throne. And the Fujiwara family became the power behind the throne. In fact, for several hundred years, every emperor married a daughter of the Fujiwara family, and her father, the Fujiwara father, really was the power behind the throne. He was named regent, kind of like prime minister, and so for several generations, while they had no official power, the Fujiwara family was really controlling the throne, and that all began during this Nara period. The next major period is called the Heian period. The Heian period was particular. This is when Kyoto was the capital. Kyoto still, how many of you all live in Kyoto? Kyoto still is one of the most beautiful cities in the world because of the number of gardens and shrines and temples. In fact, during the Second World War, when the Allies, the Americans, were deciding if they were going to drop the atomic bomb, where were they going to drop it? And because of the historical importance of Kyoto, somebody proposed Kyoto. But the Secretary of War, Stimson, he and his wife had visited there before the war, the time between the wars, and he knew how beautiful it was, and he said, no, absolutely not, take it off the list. And so Kyoto was never bombed during the Second World War. Neither was it a target of an atomic bomb, nor the firebombing that occurred during the war. 67 cities in Japan, not counting Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were pretty much destroyed by the B-29 bombing raids. But Kyoto was untouched, and so if you make it to Kyoto, which I hope you will, then, but that means staying on for the next cruise, all right? They haven't told me to pitch people staying on, but we've had people do that before, so. But when they moved to Kyoto, it was during this period of time in the 10th century that they developed the Japanese scripts, and Japanese literature really came to its own because it was no longer just Chinese script. Now, Japanese script was heavily based upon Chinese script, and still today, within the Japanese language, there are Chinese characters that are normally incorporated into that. Frequently, there will be two different ways to speak to identify something, either in the Japanese script or with a Chinese character. As one lecturer that I heard talk about this, it's like if someone is a tailor in English, they could be a Schneider in German, because Schneider is the German word for tailor. Well, if in your culture you use either one of those words interchangeably, that would be similar to the way the Japanese language does it with Japanese characters versus Chinese characters. And one other thing I will mention to you, You may be wondering, why did it used to be Peking and now it's Beijing, and in between it was Beiping? Why did it used to be Mao Zedong and now it's Mao Zedong? In the 1950s, they introduced a new way of transliterating Chinese characters. I'm telling you this in advance of us getting there, but then that affected some of the Japanese language as well. They used to have a system where it had a lot of apostrophes in it, and it did not accurately reflect how to pronounce things nearly as well as it should have. In the 1950s, they introduced a new way of transliterating Chinese characters. Transliterating means take each character and turn it into a letter in another language. You know, Mao Zedong, his name obviously isn't spelled M-A-O, you know, etc. in the original Chinese. So transliterating is when you put it into our letters. They introduced a new system called Pinyin in the 1950s, eventually caught on, and so today you will see things spelled in both directions because people are used to the old way, if you've read anything at all, the Wei-Giles system. But Pinyin is the modern system and the one that's been officially recognized, and more everything's changing to that. So that's why that may be a little confusing to you. It's also true that some names were changed from the colonial names back to original language names, but that's a sidebar. So during the Heian period, the government was very concerned about the regional affairs, but they began, that is, the taxing. That was the real point, is how do we make sure that we get the taxes from the land we own through the Ritsuro system. But the government actually got lazier and lazier, and instead of sending out and supporting their own governors, they asked local landlords, or actually warlords in many cases. They're called the daimyo. Daimyo literally means great lands. They were the big landowners. Most of those were some sort of lower nobility in the Japanese hierarchy anyway, and so they asked them to be responsible for collecting the taxes. And everyone was supposed to pay taxes except for religious shrines, either Buddhist or Shinto. They were exempt from taxes. And as a special way of paying or honoring people who worked for the government or were deserving of reward, the government would give them property that was tax exempt. These pieces of property were obviously very valuable because they didn't have to pay anything back to the central government. Well, when the government in Kyoto got lazy and started asking the local governors or daimyos to be responsible for the taxes instead of having to send out their own paid workers to do it, those landlords, daimyo, started finding very creative ways to line their own pockets. They would take property that they owned or that they decided to purchase and build a shrine on it. Ding, ding, ding. Or they would have, because they had local authority, they would declare more and more pieces of property as being one of these special tax-free estate gifts from the government because they were government representatives. And over a period of time, more and more and more of the land ended up not generating any return back to the federal government, and it created a huge economic problem for them. But because the local daimyos were responsible for going out and collecting taxes, and sometimes unfairly collecting taxes, they needed their own, strong-arm guys. They needed their own soldiers to go out and do that. They were not part of the federal, army. They were not part of the Imperial army. And so they began to develop their own small armies of warriors, and these warriors were called samurai. And you ended up with samurai, these trained military men. They were trained in martial arts, meaning military arts. And anybody who's been involved in the military will tell you one of the most difficult things is to have a trained army with nobody to fight, because they will invariably get themselves into trouble, right? So what happened with the samurai, when they didn't have anybody to fight, they started fighting each other. And you ended up with this very difficult situation. Eventually, it came to a period they called the Warring States, because the samurai armies of the various daimyos started fighting each other. And some of the daimyos would join together and join forces to fight some other, and they would take property from each other. And it began to be a really big problem. One of the reasons that this is a period, by the way, in which the emperors were weaker is because this is when we began to have the first of the child emperors, people who inherited the throne but were children. And so the real control was their father-in-law, the Fujiwara father-in-law, who was the regent, and he would be controlling things. And he was primarily interested in just maintaining power in the capital and getting a good penny out of it. So it was while Kyoto was still the capital that we have more and more of the daimyos who not only are taking over, but they're also building castles. This is what a Japanese castle looks like. The top part of it looks like just an amazing house, but you will notice that they have very high stone walls around the bottoms. So each daimyo would have as his center of operation, would have a castle like this where he lived. But increasingly, as the daimyo and their samurais had more and more authority, and they began to fight each other, the emperor was pretty much powerless to do anything about it, because the imperial forces at that time were no longer capable of really putting up a fight about anything. Eventually, there is a major war that happens between the various daimyos and their samurai soldiers. They sort of divided up into two sides. One side led by a family called the Taira, and the other led by a family called the Minamotos. And the leader of the Minamoto family at that time was Minamoto no Yoritomo, excuse me. This is him. This was a photograph taken, just kidding, it's not, it's a painting of Minamoto, and he sort of sided with the emperor in what was called the Genkai War, and he defeated he and his forces defeated the samurai forces under the daimyo of the Taira family and his allies. When he defeated the other armies, it was expected that he would then just march into Kyoto and claim the throne, that he would make himself emperor. Well, he didn't do that. In fact, once he won, he retreated back to his home city, which was the city of Kamakura. This is called the Kamakura Shogunate. It was the first shogunate. In appreciation for having won this battle and settled down the warring period and the fight between all these samurai armies, the emperor named Minamoto Shogun. Shogun is taken from the Japanese Shai-i Tai-Shogun, which means the commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force against the barbarians. Japanese is a very efficient language. You know, you can get 2 syllables and have 9 English words to represent that. So he was named Shogun, which is sort of like the title Generalissimo, which was the title that Chiang Kai-shek had, for instance, which means the military ruler. Well, at this point, though, the emperor and the imperial government was still very weak. And so once the shogunate was set up under Minamoto, he began to run the country. And even though he was technically just named shogun and sort of military head, he ended up literally developing the systems of government underneath, a judicial system and everything else, and all of the power in the country shifted over to the shogun, and the emperor was just a figurehead. So at this point, and the government of the shogun, by the way, was called the Bakufu. From 1192 to 1333, the Kamakura Bakufu, the shogunate, were under this family, and they maintained the authority. This, again, other images, the shoguns this is another shogun, were involved in much of the religious practice. In fact, it was during the first shogunate, the Kamakura shogunate, there was a lot of the shoguns and their daimyos who really committed themselves to Buddhism in a big way. It was the first time that the senior people in the country, with the exception of some of the princes, had really supported it. In fact, the Buddhist faith came to be associated with the shogun and the daimyo, to the extent that when the shoguns finally were thrown out of power, the emperor in the Meiji Restoration tried to get rid of Buddhism because it was so strongly associated with the shogunate. Interestingly enough, during this period of time, the Mongols, by now Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, had taken over as the emperor of the Yuan dynasty of China, which is the closest to Japan. On 2 occasions, the Mongol armies of the Yuan Chinese dynasty tried to invade Japan in 1274 and 1281. I mentioned this when I talked about the kamikazes, because both times, in 1274 and 1281, both times typhoons, surprisingly, they say out of nowhere, blew up and destroyed either most or all of the Mongol navies. So that the Japanese were saved from these really, I mean, the Mongols didn't get beat very often, but in this case they were defeated twice when they tried to invade Japan by typhoons. Those typhoons were called kamikaze, which means divine wind or a godly wind. Kamikaze later was used, of course, for the suicide attacks of the Japanese army in the Second World War. But Japan was saved from being invaded by the Mongols by these divine winds. Here's a couple of other images. This is Minamoto on the left, who is receiving a Buddhist blessing. Remember, big focus on Buddhism there, by releasing cranes into the wild. And this is Minamoto Yoshihito, who is the one who eventually killed and took over from the first of the shoguns in the Minamoto line. The next period we get into is the Motomachi. Motomachi is an area of near Tokyo, and so the family name was Ashikaga. They introduced beautiful buildings at that time. There was a lot of art in this period of time, but there was still a lot of civil war going on between the shogun and daimyos, various daimyos. It was during this period of time in 1543 that the Europeans arrived in Japan. The Spanish and the Portuguese, the first thing that happened was a group of Portuguese sailors were shipwrecked off Kyushu and were taken into the country, and they convinced the Japanese at this point in the 1500s that, you should let us come back and trade, and so they were open to that. In 1549, just a few years later, the Catholic missionary Francis Xavier, the Jesuit missionary, came. There was a fairly significant conversion to Christianity, even among some of the daimyo of these warlords. A lot of the farmers converted to Christianity. They found it very attractive. But then, toward the end of this time, we have the Tokugawa Shogunate, which would end up being the very last of the shoguns, the last lines of the shoguns. It was during this period of time they constructed a lot of those brilliant castles that you can still see today. In fact, some of the, in Japan, are some of the oldest wooden buildings in the world. They have wooden buildings that are as old as the 600s. But there are quite a few of the castles that were built later on, like in the 1600s, where that are still taken care of and still existing today. Well, during the Tokugawa period, Japan tried twice to invade Korea. In 1592 and 1598, they were defeated both times. And at that point, the Japanese started thinking, maybe we shouldn't be messing with all these outside forces. We shouldn't be trying to invade other countries or even visit other countries. And maybe we shouldn't let all these people coming in here, because the emphasis on Buddhism was so strong that when you started getting daimyos and a lot of farmers converting to Christianity, this foreign religion as they saw it, they saw a real danger there. They saw the growth of a trade for the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, and said, this is money we ought to be keeping here in Japan. So under the Tokugawa shogunate, they developed an absolute moratorium on any international interaction. This is a beacon that was used put up in 1644 to use as a beacon in case any foreign ships were seen in the harbors. The Tokugawa shogunate set up what was called the Sakoku policy. Sakoku means isolation. And from 1623, for the next 220 years, until the 1800s, there was a policy where no Japanese, unless they were very high-ranking and had permission of the emperor, no Japanese could leave Japan, no foreigners could come into Japan, and there was very limited foreign trade. The Dutch had managed to convince them to let the Dutch East India Company continue to trading out of only one port, Nagasaki. It was very tightly controlled. No one else was allowed in. Now, during this period of time, there were a lot of efforts. Almost all the Western powers, including Germany and Britain and even Russia, not a Western power, were trying to land at ports and convince the Japanese to let them trade with them, and they would not do it. They would not let them land their ships or enter into trade. They were absolutely adamant about that because they had become convinced that the foreign influence was a really bad thing. And in fact, during this period of time, I was talking to somebody about the movie about the Portuguese missionaries and Christians that were there. There was a massive persecution of Christians. They passed laws that made it illegal to be a Christian or to advocate Christianity on penalty of death. They made it illegal to be a foreigner and set foot on Japan on penalty of death. They made it illegal to try to leave Japan on penalty to death. They were serious about this. So because of that, Japan still has the lowest percentage of Christians in all of the Far East. I mean, the Philippines is 90% Christian. South Korea is more than 40% Christian, and yet it's only 1% Christian in Japan. And that's because of this Tokugawa Shogunate and their isolationism policy. However, despite their isolationism, I talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about the history earlier. Matthew Perry was a Commodore in the U.S. Navy, and in 1853 he sailed into Edo Bay, the harbor of what we know of as Tokyo. Edo later on was called Tokyo, which means the eastern capital. He sailed into the harbor with 4 gunboats. These gunboats had the most sophisticated shell-armed cannon in the world. Shell meaning they weren't just shooting solid case, they were explosives. And he fired off some rounds, some blank rounds, just to let them know what it would look like. When he landed, he demanded to see the Emperor. Well, the Emperor wasn't in charge. The Shogun was in charge. So instead, contrary to all of what they'd done before, they let him land. They took him and some of his officers, and that's what this image is supposed to represent, is Perry in the middle. That's an image of him down there. And 2 of his officers were allowed to meet with the Shogun, and they presented a letter from the President of the United States saying, we want to be able to trade with you. And Commodore Perry made it very clear to them that those gunships I have outside, there's just 4 of those. We got a lot more where those came from, and we intend to trade with you. It made the Japanese aware that their 220 years of isolationism had put them far behind the Western world in terms of technology, because for 220 years they literally had not advanced. There was no new technology, there virtually no changes. And all of a sudden, these armies of samurai who were who had fought with swords and spears were faced with exploding shell guns, cannons. And so they said, well, let us think about it. He said, I'll be back in a year. Well, he came back 6 months later, just in February of 1854, and said, I need your decision. And this time he brought 7 gunships, just to sort of make it clear there was more where those came from. And they decided it was time to open themselves up to the Western world. And so in 1854, they agreed that they would start allowing Americans and then later on other Western powers to come in and trade with them. In 1868, not very long after that, there was a new emperor that came in, who is called the Meiji Emperor. Meiji means the enlightened peace. And the Meiji Emperor decided that now that they had seen what the Western world was capable of, that they had all of these sophisticated weapons and all of this modern technology, which they'd been seeing now for just a little over 10 years, that it was time for Japan to shake off all of those old tendencies, all of that isolationism. And at that point, 2 of the major daimyos, the daimyo of Satsuma and of Chosun, got together and decided they were going to overthrow, in support of the emperor, they were going to overthrow the last of the Tokugawa Shogunate. And they did so. They got allies, their armies marched on and defeated the Shogun. He was actually not only, he finally abdicated, he stepped down because he thought he would get a major role in the new government, and they didn't give him anything. In fact, they took his property away from him. And so at that point, it's called the Meiji Restoration, because no longer was the emperor a powerless figure and the shogun running everything, but now the emperor was really in control again. And from that point on, over the next 30 years from Japan, the Meiji Emperor sent out delegations and students to all the Western powers. They invited Western counselors in, particularly military counselors. They had French and Prussian instructors in their military schools. They began to industrialize. They became a major manufacturing country. They began to develop significant weapons along the line, and they were buying a lot of weapons as well. Britain was selling them warships. So in 30 years, they went from being a very, a 200-year out-of-date country to being a very modern power. And the Meiji Emperor was responsible for that. They also did away with the feudal system. The samurai didn't care for this because the samurai had been one level of the feudal system. No longer was there a feudal system. In fact, there were no more samurai. They were not allowed to carry swords. They were not allowed to wear the traditional samurai top knot. All of the samurai were given a sort of a retirement fund, but most of them didn't know anything about managing money, so most of them ended up having to go back to work on farms. It was a very difficult time for them. But the huge change, as I mentioned before, when we talked about China versus Japan, the problem that Japan had was that they were trying to industrialize and create all this manufacturing stuff and create all these weapons, but Japan has no oil, they have no coal, they have no steel. And so whereas they were fine when they were an agrarian culture, now they needed those resources. And so they began to try to influence Korea, first in trade and then in conflict with China. We ended up with the first Sino-Japanese War, which was primarily over control of Korea. When they won that war, the Japanese, to everyone's astonishment, in 6 months defeated the much larger power China. They ended up taking over control of Korea as well as other areas that were ceded to them, including Taiwan was given to Japan at that point. It had been part of China. And they began to use those resources. But still, it wasn't enough. Russia came in at that point and started trying to take some of those things away from them. So we have the Russo-Japanese War. If everybody thought it was astonishing that the Japanese defeated the Chinese, when the Japanese defeated the Russians in 1904, 1905, the world was just unbelieving. They destroyed 2 of the 3 major fleets of the Russian Navy, which were one of the largest navies in the world at that time. So very powerful. Japan had made their mark. They felt like they had earned the right to be able to get the resources they need, because in that period of time, late 1800s, early 1900s, the imperial powers of the West were building empires still. There were 6 major empires in the European arena at the start of the First World War. Now, 4 of those were completely gone by the time it was over. And yet those empires were built upon the idea that if we have the technology and the strength, we can go into Africa or South America or wherever else and take what we want. Japan thought, hey, they're doing it. We've now proven we're strong enough to do it. Why can't we do that too? And so you saw the rise, because of needs they felt, of Imperial Japan. The militarists began to take over. Japan, after winning those 2 wars, felt like expansion was their right, that they had earned it, and so they moved into the Manchuria in 1930, because Russia had controlled much of Manchuria and other areas, and so when the Japanese defeated them, the Japanese just stepped in when the Russians left, because they had won that war. Then the Japanese ended up faking an event, the Mukden Incident or Manchurian Incident in 1931, that gave them the right, they thought, to send an army in to protect their investments. They turned it into a puppet state, Manchukuo. And during this period of time, all the Western powers saw Japan expanding into Manchuria and had desires for some of the rest of Southeast Asia. And they said, you have to get out of there. And the U.S. and others started putting in embargoes against oil and food and other things. Japan felt like that was cutting off their lifeblood, and so that's what led the Japanese to decide that they needed to fight the United States, especially because we were the only major naval power in the Pacific Ocean other than Japan. And so Japan, after December 7th, 1941, they attacked Pearl Harbor. They attacked 6 other locations that were under the protection of either the U.S. or Great Britain within 7 hours of the launch of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They began this very aggressive effort to try to take over most of the Pacific. They really were turned back at Midway Island, where 4 of their major aircraft carriers were destroyed by the American aircraft carrier fleet. And the Americans and others, the British were involved, the Australians were involved, continued a campaign, the Pacific War campaign, and the last great battle of that was Okinawa, where we just were, and many of you saw the War Memorial and other things, the horrific devastation. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. And from Okinawa, they were preparing to launch an invasion of the home islands of Japan, but they fully expected that there could be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 million to 2 million deaths if they tried to invade the homeland. And so, on August 6th, a new weapon that had just been developed, had only been tested once, August 6th, a nuclear weapon was dropped on Hiroshima. 2 days later, on the 8th of August, the Russian Empire declared war, or the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and started to send their wars down into Manchuria again. And then on the 9th, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And the war came to an end when the emperor, actually, contrary to all tradition, stepped in and said, we need to accept the offered surrender terms and we need to end this war. The emperors had never done anything like that before since they'd become a constitutional monarchy. This is a very famous picture because most Japanese had never seen the emperor before. They had never heard his voice until they played a recording of him saying, we have to accept the surrender. When this picture was issued, this of course is Douglas MacArthur, who was the Supreme Allied Commander in charge of Japan after the war, and then later Korea, and Emperor Hirohito. This picture, when it was first sent out by the U.S. military press, the Japanese government declared that this was not to be published because it shows the more than 6 foot tall MacArthur next to the quite small Hirohito. And this man Hirohito had thought to have been a god by the Japanese, is sort of being overwhelmed by this large commander. In fact, they ended up calling MacArthur the Gaijin Shogun, because he was the military ruler, if you will. Well, MacArthur insisted that they were going to publish this. In fact, he sent out an order that every newspaper in Japan was to publish this picture so that they would have a perspective that the emperor, while he was very respectful of the emperor, and the way he treated the emperor and the government was one of the reasons why the Japanese fairly quickly accepted the occupation by the Allied forces. Japan became a miracle of economic recovery after that. As you well know, for the longest time, everything was made in Japan. For a while, that meant something cheap, right? Oh, made in Japan. Then later on, made in Japan was a sign of quality, right? How many of you drive Japanese cars? Because you know that they're dependable, right? Now, made in China has sort of replaced that in terms of this actually is an image from the 2011 tsunami. There was an earthquake on March 11th, 2011, and it ended up creating an enormous tsunami, what we used to call tidal wave, which flooded much of the area of northern Honshu, and particularly it caused damage to the Fujiyama nuclear plant. And there is still serious problems because of the release of radioactivity that was caused not by an error on the part of the Japanese, but because of this natural disaster. But in the 60s, 70s, 80s, Japan was remarkable in its economic recovery, in its cultural development, in its advancement. The 90s, the economy was such that it sort of flattened off a little bit. They're still very healthy, but they're not nearly the power they were economically there for a while. But this has been our history and story with Japan. That's a very brief history, which I took 44 minutes to do. Any questions about any of that? You always laugh when I ask if there are any questions. Anything, yes?
In the Meiji period, this was an agrarian country, almost purely, of course, at that point.
Right.
And so it was perfectly understandable that after 30 years, they'd be going after resources. But what happened in the middle of those 30 years? They were starting essentially with nothing. What were they trading in order to generate the ability to leverage themselves upward?
Right. And during the Meiji period, the question is, and I put this back up there again because as I mentioned the other day, you'll notice they're wearing primarily Western clothes. Also, the images from the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, the soldiers of Japan are wearing what look like fairly modern uniforms compared to the robes of the Chinese. Now, the question is, how did they leverage themselves up if they were entirely an agrarian society? Well, they began to trade with Korea, and one of the reasons that they wanted Korea was because Korea had those resources. Korea's got coal and oil and iron. They were trading with China. They were getting some loans from other countries in order to advance. Some of it was because they were opening trade of what little they did produce, which were textiles and then food products and things like that. They did receive credit for the purchase of military weapons and other manufacturing and capabilities from, say, Britain, some from France. So much of it was just other countries were wanting to help them because they saw the potential initially of Japan being an industrialized nation being good for everybody. And so there was a lot of support for that, and they traded what they had, or they simply negotiated for it, and it was a very slow process. Slowly they built it up as they developed the initial ability to manufacture. That gained them a little more ground and a little more ground and a little more ground. Later on, the Western powers were a little bit sad that they had done all that to assist them because obviously the militarism and the imperialistic kind of view of Japan, the idea that they had a right to conquer other nations, which they actually had learned from the Western powers, created a worldwide problem. Okay, but yeah, it was just a very slow process. They took what they had and then they began to build from there. Other questions? Yes?
What's the percentage of religions in Japan now?
The percentage of religions in Japan now, as I mentioned, there's only between 1% and 2%. Some people say 2%, some say 1% Christian. The vast majority of people practice, 80% of people, it's estimated, practice Shinto. Although if you ask them what religion, on a poll, a survey, what religions they belong to, very few of them list Shinto because they don't think of Shinto as a religion. They think of it as a way of life. It's part of their culture. There's about 35% Buddhist in the nation. And because, how do you get 80% of one thing and 35% of another thing, right? Well, it's because most of them have accepted the idea of a syncretism between Shinto and Buddhism, which has been fairly formalized there. The two of them are seen as being complementary, not contradictory. And so that's kind of the layout of it right now. And there are bits and pieces of other things, but those are the primary ones. And so when I talked about the religions of Japan, it was entirely Shinto and various schools of Buddhism, because that's the vast majority of everything, okay? Down here first, yes?
Yeah, in the beginning you talked about the land bridges.
Mm-hmm.
When we were in Taiwan, one of the guides talked about being native as far as being considered, I guess, people from the islands. And
Right.
so was there, and I'll tell you with DNA, I guess you can probably tell there's maybe some difference. Was there a lot of travel by the small islanders, like continuing around? And I guess they say, theory-wise, that some of that might even came over to America.
Right. So the idea of if there were land bridges or whatever, where did the people come from? What was the mixture? The genetic testing has shown that the Japanese people, that is the native Japanese people, what we think of as native now, are a fairly even mix of Asiatic blood and Polynesian blood, because influence from other island areas. There have been a couple of fairly distinct tribal groups, particularly up in the north. The Shogun, the title Shogun originally was the commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force against barbarians. Well, the barbarians they were talking about were some of the indigenous people on the north, Honshu and on Hokkaido. There were a couple of the Ainu people and the Misa people, I think it was, and they were considered barbarians and not true Japanese because they had not intermarried in the same way. Most of them have now intermarried, and there's not the distinction. But they do believe it was primarily a combination of Asian people who have come across from the land bridges and Polynesian, because of course the Polynesian peoples were very mobile. They explored the whole Pacific. landed in Hawaii and every place else. It's astonishing they went that far in open boats, but they did. And so that's where the people come from now. But they are able to identify percentages of things. Up here first and then back. Yes?
Most countries develop from regional kind of games, jigs, local else. Didn't give it any sense of what Japan did. Japan obviously didn't become a nation to itself until some point in time.
Right.
When was that?
When did they become a nation? Well, under the Yamato period, which started in the 3rd century, AD, not BC, the Yamato period is not considered the Imperial period yet, although they had Atenyo, who was seen as the ambassador of heaven, kind of thing. You know, and that was a case where one of the areas, sort of tribal group, would have a leader, and this is how almost every country that has become an empire has happened. They then conquered the guys next door, or got them to agree to be underneath their authority, and then they together, with that added strength, they took over another area. Well, the Yamato period is the first period, starting in the 3rd century, when they began to have a fairly large area that were controlled by one court and one leader, the Tenyo. Later on, it wasn't until the Nara period, which is considered the really imperial period, because at that point they had expanded in that way in order to take over almost all of the islands. And initially it really was a matter of, you take over a little bit at a time as you develop the power to do that. And that's been the case all over the world, as countries grew and took over more property. Yes?
Given the Chinese-Japanese history, what is your personal view of how, with China emerging as a major global economic power,
Right.
and Japan being semi-flat over the last couple decades or so, do the Japanese feel threatened by the Chinese? Do you ever envision a scenario where the Chinese and Japanese truly can embrace each other as colleagues, or is there always going to be this historical anxiety and tension between the cultures?
So the question is, given the fact that China is now a dominant economic power in the world and Japan is flat, I don't want to say stagnant, but they're not on a growth phase anymore the way they were for 30 years. Is there ever a time when the Japanese, and do they continue to feel threatened? Are the Japanese feeling threatened, or is there a time when I foresee that they could get together and embrace one another and relate to one another well? No. Just kidding. For one thing, I think a lot of people and I'm not an economist, but my own study of it says that I think a lot of people over-expect what's going to happen in China from the Chinese side, that China is going to continue to be this massive powerhouse. China has huge problems. Problems of control, problems of environmental degradation, quality control issues, and so I think that they may be in a cycle as well. Japan is doing quite well, thank you, and Japan is independent enough. I mean, they're dependent upon trade and things, but they have enough partners in the West now that they would not need to rely on China. I mean, they do have trade relations. I've run too long. This is the captain speaking.
Well, a very good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. This is the captain speaking for the bridge, and the time is 12 o'clock.